This is my true story. I was a father who spent a lifetime working, giving, and forgiving. I thought love was enough to keep a family together, until my own son proved me wrong. One night, I asked for a small extra serving of food. What happened next changed everything. My son threw my plate to the ground and said words I'll never forget. "Dogs eat here, not you." That moment ended something inside me, but it also began something else, a quiet revenge. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so my story can reach more people. He had spent his entire life building a world for his son, a world where love was plenty, food was never short, and dreams were never too big to chase. The old man's hands, once strong and sure, were covered in the calluses of decades of hard work. He remembered the long summers when the sun burned his skin as he carried bricks, laid cement, and repaired roofs just to earn enough to buy his son a better pair of shoes for school. Those shoes, shiny and new, had made the boy smile once, a smile that used to mean everything to the father. That smile was worth every drop of sweat, every ache in his back, every meal he skipped to stretch the week's wages. The house they lived in had been built by his own hands. Brick by brick, he had raised it out of love and dreams. He remembered how he would come home from work, covered in dust, and still make time to sit beside his son, helping with homework, even when his eyes could barely stay open. The boy would ask questions, innocent and curious, about the world, and the father would answer, believing he was building not just a home, but a heart full of gratitude. Years later, those same walls would witness the sound of disrespect, but back then, they echoed with laughter and bedtime stories. He had never been a rich man, but he had never let his family feel poor. His wife cooked simple meals, lentils, rice, and vegetables, but those meals were served with pride, not shame. When the boy wanted toys other children had, the father would pick up extra shifts. When the boy wanted to study in a better school, he would take loans quietly, never telling his wife how much debt they carried. He didn't care about comfort for himself. His shoes were worn, his shirts faded, but his son's life was polished and bright. The boy grew up never knowing what hunger felt like. Every morning, his father would rise before dawn, even when his bones ached, to prepare breakfast and make sure the boy left with a full stomach. He remembered how proud he felt the day his son graduated. That day, the father wore his oldest coat, stitched at the seams but clean, and stood in the crowd, clapping the loudest. He didn't care that no one clapped for him. Watching his son step up to the stage was his reward. In that moment, he thought he had done everything right. But love, he would later learn, doesn't always age well. The boy who once hugged him tightly before school began to grow distant. The son who once brought him tea when he was tired started pretending not to hear him. Time had changed everything, except the father's heart. He still believed in kindness, still thought patience could heal arrogance. He refused to believe that the same boy he once rocked to sleep could grow into someone who would one day look at him with disgust. He had taught his son to respect elders, to be humble, to help others. He taught him that no matter how high a man climbed, he should never forget the hands that lifted him. The son learned those lessons well, or so it seemed. When success came, it didn't bring gratitude, it brought pride. The son moved into a new job, earned more than his father ever had, and started walking with his chest higher, his voice sharper. The old man saw it, but said nothing. He didn't want to shame him, didn't want to create distance. He told himself, he's young, he'll learn. But the truth was, the boy wasn't learning humility, he was learning power. The father's love remained unconditional. He would wake up early and sweep the courtyard. He would clean the son's car, polish it, and wait for him to leave for work. When the son was gone, he would sit on the porch quietly, sipping tea, thinking of how time had passed so fast. He still prayed for his son every morning, prayed for his happiness, his success, his safety. The prayers were pure, even when the love wasn't returned. Sometimes when he cooked dinner, he would make the son's favorite dishes, the ones from childhood. But when he placed the plates on the table, the son barely noticed. He would scroll through his phone, eat half-heartedly, and leave without a word. The old man would still sit there, finishing his meal alone, pretending it didn't hurt. He would tell himself, he's tired from work. He made excuses for cruelty because that's what love does when it's one-sided. He began to notice the son's tone changing. There were sighs, rolling eyes, and short replies. When the father forgot small things, like turning off the lights or misplacing the keys, the son's voice would rise. He would snap, mock, and complain. But the father still stayed silent. In his heart, he believed one truth. A parent's silence is not weakness. It's love holding back from breaking its own child. Then came the night that would change everything. The father had worked all day in the garden, trying to fix the fence. His back hurt, and his hands trembled. When dinner was served, he asked quietly if he could have just a little more rice. That single request opened the gates of hell. The son stood up furious, as if insulted by the question. He grabbed the plate and threw it to the ground. The food scattered, rice mixing with dust. And then came the words, cruel, sharp, unforgettable. Dogs eat here, not you. The sound of those words echoed in the father's head long after the room went silent. His wife froze. The son walked away, and the father stood still, staring at the food on the floor. He didn't bend to pick it up. He didn't say a word. He simply turned and walked to his room. That night, the house was quiet, but inside, something had died. The man who had lived his life for love now learned what betrayal truly sounded like. Lying in bed, he thought about the meals he had skipped when his son was a child. He thought about the nights he had gone hungry just so his boy could eat a little more. He remembered the small hands that once fed him pieces of bread during play. And now, those same hands had thrown food to the floor and called him less than human. The memories came like waves, each one heavier, sharper, crueler. He cried silently that night, not because of hunger, but because of the realization that his years of sacrifice had built not gratitude, but greed. He understood now that love without boundaries becomes a cage. He had fed pride thinking it was affection. He had watered arrogance thinking it was confidence. Now he could see it clearly. He had raised a son who knew comfort but not compassion. The night stretched long. He sat by the window, watching the moonlight fall on the floor where his dinner had been thrown. In that reflection, he saw himself, broken but not defeated. He promised himself that this moment would not be the end of his story. He would not scream. He would not curse. He would not lift his hand or his voice, but he would act. And when he did, the lesson would be one that could never be forgotten. By morning, his tears had dried. The pain had hardened into resolve. He went to his cupboard, took out the house papers, and looked at them carefully. The property was still his, every line, every signature. His name, not his son's, owned these walls. He smiled faintly. The man who was called a dog still owned the cage his master lived in. As the sun rose, he made tea for himself, slow and deliberate. He no longer felt weak. He knew what he had to do. That day, a father stopped being a servant and became the teacher his son had long forgotten. It didn't begin with shouting. It began with sighs, small, sharp, and filled with quiet annoyance. The kind of sighs that say more than words ever could. The father started noticing them when he asked small questions. "Did you eat?" Or, "How was work?" His son would respond with half-hearted replies, eyes still glued to his phone, barely acknowledging that his father existed in the same room. Those sighs were the first cracks in the wall that once held love and respect. They were quiet, but they echoed deep. The father ignored them at first. He told himself it was just stress, that work was hard and everyone had bad days. He wanted to believe the son he raised was still somewhere beneath the arrogance. He had seen that boy cry, laugh, stumble, and rise. He had seen him learn to walk and fall asleep on his chest. A sigh couldn't mean hate, he thought, not from his own flesh and blood. But it wasn't just sighs anymore. Soon, words began to sting. At first, they were disguised as jokes. "You don't understand the world anymore. You're too old to get it." They sounded harmless, but the tone carried poison. The father would smile, pretending not to notice, pretending not to hurt. He laughed when everyone else laughed, though his chest tightened every time. His son spoke louder now, his voice heavy with pride, as if success had given him permission to forget humility. The old man had always been slow with technology, and whenever he asked for help with his phone or television, the son would roll his eyes. "You press this, not that," he would say, his tone sharp. Once, he even snatched the remote from his father's hand, muttering that he couldn't deal with this old nonsense. That night, the father went to bed earlier than usual. He stared at the ceiling, thinking about how something as small as patience had vanished from his son's heart. Meals became quiet battles. The table that once carried laughter now carried silence and tension. The father would try to speak, but his son would scroll through his phone, nodding without listening. His wife sat between them, afraid to take sides. The house was no longer a home. It was a stage where love had turned into duty and care had turned into burden. The father tried everything: kindness, humor, even silence, but nothing softened his son's heart. He remembered one evening vividly. The power had gone out, and they sat in candlelight. The father smiled and said, "It feels like old times, doesn't it?" His son just scoffed, saying he had no time for nostalgia. That small moment stayed with him longer than the words themselves. It was a reminder that his son no longer saw him as part of his world, only as an outdated figure from a past he wished to erase. The father's body grew weaker with age, but his heart stayed steady. He still made his son's tea in the mornings, still waited for him to come home at night. But the warmth in those gestures was one-sided now. The son began to treat his father's care like an obligation, something expected rather than appreciated. When the old man tried to share advice, the son would interrupt, telling him that the world had changed, that his way of thinking didn't belong anymore. The father realized he wasn't just being ignored, he was being erased. Slowly, his role in the household shrank. Decisions were made without him. Conversations happened around him, not with him. Even when family visited, his son spoke over him, correcting small things he said, laughing off his stories as if they were myths from another lifetime. Every correction was a small cut, and over time, those cuts turned into scars too deep to ignore. He noticed that his son's tone changed most when others were present. In private, the disrespect was subtle: sharp looks, cold words, quick dismissals. But in public, it was worse. The son wanted to show that he was in control, that he was modern, powerful, and above old traditions. When neighbors visited, he spoke to his father like an employee, giving short commands, pretending authority was care. The father endured it quietly, his smile masking pain. The mother saw it all but said little. She knew her son's temper and feared confrontation. She would comfort her husband at night, whispering that things would change, that he should stay calm. But deep inside, even she began to fear her son's growing pride. It was no longer just arrogance. It was cruelty wrapped in self-importance. The father knew it too, but he wasn't ready to fight back. Not yet. He believed that patience could still turn the tide. Then came the small humiliations. His son began locking cupboards, controlling money, questioning how his father spent even small amounts. "You don't need much," he'd say when the father asked for basic things. The man who had built the house with his hands now had to ask permission to buy bread. He never complained aloud. His silence became his only shield. But silence also became the weapon that others used to hurt him. Days turned into weeks, and the father began to feel invisible in his own home. The respect that once defined their bond had dissolved into control and command. He would walk around the house, touching the walls he had painted himself, remembering how much love had gone into building it. Each memory was heavy now, each room filled with ghosts of laughter that no longer existed. The turning point came one morning when the father accidentally spilled tea on the dining table. It was a small mistake, but his son reacted as if it were a crime. He shouted, slammed his fist on the table, and stormed off, muttering that his father couldn't do anything right anymore. That day, the father didn't cry. He didn't even react. He just cleaned the table quietly and went about his chores. But something inside him began to change. Patience was no longer peace. It was surrender. That night, he sat outside on the porch, staring at the stars. The wind was cold, but he stayed there for hours. He thought about how love had turned into humiliation, how his home had turned into a prison. He had raised his son to be kind, but somewhere along the way, kindness had been replaced with pride, and now that pride ruled the house. He knew then that this wouldn't stop on its own. Every insult was turning into habit, every act of disrespect into normal behavior. The son no longer saw him as a father, only as a burden that age had made inconvenient. The old man's silence had become permission, and permission had become power. He realized that disrespect doesn't start big. It begins small, a sigh, a joke, a careless tone, and grows into something poisonous if left unchallenged. He had given his son too much comfort, too much trust, and too much control. Now he was reaping the bitter fruit of his own kindness. The night before everything broke, the father couldn't sleep. He sat at the edge of his bed, thinking about what he had done wrong. He wasn't angry, only tired of being treated like a shadow in his own home. He knew his love had become his weakness, but love can also become strength when it stops expecting kindness in return. When morning came, he looked at himself in the mirror. The wrinkles on his face told stories of sacrifice and pain. He wasn't ashamed of them. Each line was a memory of a day he chose love over pride, patience over anger. But now he understood. The time for silence had ended. The son had forgotten what hunger, humility, and hard work felt like. It was time for him to remember. That morning, the father began to plan. Not revenge through shouting or violence, but through lesson and consequence. He would not curse his son. He would teach him. He would remind him that respect is not inherited. It is earned. The same way a man earns food on his table, he must earn the right to share it. He looked at the dining table where his son would soon throw food and thought, "This will be the last time he does this," and walks away unscathed. His plan didn't come from hatred. It came from clarity. The father's silence had ended. That night would become the moment his son lost his humanity, and the next morning would be the day he got it back, but not before learning what hunger truly tastes like. That evening began like any other, quiet, heavy, and filled with the kind of silence that only broken families know. The air in the house was thick, unmoving. The father sat at the table, his back slightly bent, hands trembling from age and fatigue. His eyes were gentle, hopeful still, though his heart carried years of unseen bruises. The smell of food filled the room, the same simple dishes he had once loved, rice, lentils, and vegetables. But tonight, they didn't taste like home anymore. He had worked in the small garden that day, planting seeds and trimming old plants. It was his way of finding peace. Every seed he pressed into the soil felt like a prayer, for patience, for strength, for the love he no longer recognized in his son's eyes. When dinner time came, he washed his hands, changed into a clean shirt, and walked to the table quietly. He waited for his son to join, as he always did. When the son walked in, his footsteps were sharp, his expression irritated, as if being home was a punishment. He threw his phone on the table, glanced at his father, and said nothing. The father greeted him with a smile, trying to break the silence, but it went unanswered. His wife served the plates, small portions, enough for the three of them. The old man's hands were shaking, so he scooped less than he needed, careful not to spill. But the truth was, he hadn't eaten much that day. He was hungry, not just for food, but for a moment of kindness. After a few bites, he spoke softly. "Could I have a little more rice?" His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. His wife froze, spoon in hand, and looked at their son. The son's eyes darkened, jaw tightening. He didn't say anything for a moment, but the air had already changed. The father sensed it, that invisible tension that rises before a storm. Then, in a sudden burst of rage, the son slammed his spoon on the table. The sound was sharp, slicing through the stillness like a blade. He stood up so quickly that the chair behind him fell to the floor. The father's heart pounded. He didn't understand what could cause such anger over something so small. "You always want more," the son snapped, his voice trembling with fury. "You think this house is yours to demand from?" The old man didn't answer. He looked down at his half-empty plate, the smell of food now mixed with fear. The mother whispered for him to calm down, but her voice only made things worse. The son grabbed the plate from his father's hands, and before the old man could react, it crashed against the ground. Food splattered across the floor, rice scattered like white dust, lentils spread like stains of humiliation. The room went silent, except for the faint clinking of the broken dish. And then the son said the words that would never be forgotten. "Dogs eat here, not you." The words were simple, but they struck like lightning. The father froze. The world around him seemed to stop. For a moment, all he could hear was his own breathing, slow, uneven, fragile. He looked down at the floor where his dinner now lay in pieces. The food that once represented care and family now symbolized rejection and cruelty. The son turned away, muttering under his breath, while the mother stood frozen, tears filling her eyes but not falling. She wanted to speak, to stop him, but fear kept her still. She had seen his temper before. She knew this was not a battle of words. This was a storm that would pass only when everything was broken. The father didn't move. He stared at the food for a long time, each grain a reminder of what had been lost, not the meal, but respect. He could still remember the nights when he had gone hungry so his son could eat more. He remembered cutting his own portions short when times were tough, hiding the pain behind a smile. He remembered the pride he once felt watching his boy eat his fill, never realizing that someday that same child would look at him like he was nothing. When the son left the room, slamming the door behind him, the sound echoed through the old man's chest. It wasn't just a door closing. It was a heart shutting down. The mother knelt down, trying to clean the mess, but the father stopped her. "Leave it," he said softly. His voice didn't carry anger, only emptiness. She nodded silently and stepped aside. The father slowly bent down, his knees creaking, his fingers trembling. He picked up a handful of rice, not to eat, but to feel. The warmth of it, the smell, the texture, all reminders of love turned to ashes. He dropped it gently back to the ground, stood up, and walked to his room without looking back. That night, he sat by the window, staring at the dark sky. He didn't cry. His tears had dried up long ago, worn out by years of disappointment. Instead, he just sat there, the silence pressing against him. Outside, the streetlights flickered, and in the distance, he could hear dogs barking. He smiled bitterly at the sound. Life had a cruel way of echoing pain in strange forms. Hours passed. The clock ticked quietly in the corner, marking every second of a heart learning how to stop caring. The father didn't sleep. He replayed the moment again and again, the plate crashing, the words, the look of hatred on his son's face. It wasn't just about food. It was about dignity. It was about years of love turned into dust by one sentence. He thought about leaving that night, about walking away and never coming back. But where would he go? This was his house. His sweat had built these walls. His dreams had shaped every corner. He refused to be chased out of what was rightfully his. But he also knew staying would mean living under constant humiliation. That night, he made a decision, quiet, unspoken, and final. If respect could not be given, it would be earned through consequence. He wouldn't scream or argue. He wouldn't explain or justify. He would let the world show his son what hunger and humility truly meant. He rose before dawn the next morning, his movements slow but deliberate. The air was cold, still carrying the weight of last night's cruelty. He walked through the house silently, looking at everything one last time. The photos on the wall, the furniture he had built, the kitchen that once smelled of love. He touched the dining table gently, the same table where he had just been humiliated. Then he took the keys, the ones to the cupboards, the pantry, and the refrigerator. He locked everything. Every shelf that held food, every drawer that stored comfort, all sealed. The locks clicked quietly, each sound like a heartbeat of justice. By the time the sun rose, the house was silent again, but this time it was a different silence, not of pain, but of power. He then went to his study, opened the safe, and took out the property papers. He checked the signatures carefully. Every line was still his. Every right still belonged to him. The house was his, legally, morally, and emotionally. For the first time in years, that truth felt powerful again. When his son woke up hours later, the smell of breakfast was missing. He went to the kitchen, confused. The cupboards were locked. The fridge was locked. The table was empty. No food, no coffee, no warmth, just silence. He called for his father, irritation in his voice, but there was no answer. The old man was sitting on the porch, sipping tea he had made before locking everything. When his son appeared, demanding to know what was going on, the father stood up slowly. His eyes met his son's, calm, steady, unbroken. And with the same quiet voice that had once been ignored, he said the words that would haunt his son forever. "Dogs eat here, not you." The son froze. The same sentence now returned to him like a mirror of shame. For the first time, he understood what it felt like. The sting of words, the burn of humiliation, the taste of silence after cruelty. His throat went dry, his pride shattered. The father didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He just walked past him, leaving behind the echo of justice. The boy who had once thrown food on the floor now stood staring at that same floor, empty, hungry, and small. That night, the old man packed his bag quietly. He didn't need revenge anymore. He had already taught the lesson. The next morning, when the son ate from the floor out of hunger, the house finally found balance again. The father left at sunrise, not broken, but free. That night, the house was silent in a way it had never been before, the kind of silence that hums in your ears and feels heavier than sound. The father sat in his small room, his chair angled toward the window, staring at the faint glow of the moonlight spilling onto the cold floor. The same floor where, just hours ago, his dinner had been thrown. The same floor where his son's cruelty had crushed every last piece of dignity he still held on to. The smell of the food still lingered faintly in the air, mixed with dust and memory. It wasn't the scent of a meal anymore. It was the scent of something sacred turned rotten. He could hear faint movements in the other room, his son laughing on the phone, his voice light, unbothered, as if nothing had happened. It wasn't anger that filled the father's chest. It was something colder, deeper, a kind of quiet disbelief that someone he had raised with love could now treat him as less than human. He didn't weep. His tears had dried long ago, over countless small humiliations that had built up to this final breaking point. Tonight was not for crying. It was for remembering and deciding. He sat there, the old chair creaking beneath him, and thought about the life he had lived. The nights he had gone hungry so his son could have enough. The winters he had worked long hours, hands frozen, feet numb, just to make sure his boy never went without heat or shelter. He remembered the laughter of childhood dinners, when his son would chatter endlessly about school, his mouth full of food, his eyes bright. Those were the nights that made every sacrifice worth it. Back then, food was more than survival. It was love shared. But now, that same love had been thrown to the ground like waste. The image of the scattered rice and broken plate kept flashing in his mind. He could still hear the sound, sharp, final, cruel. He replayed his son's words over and over, as if trying to make sense of them. "Dogs eat here, not you." Each repetition was a wound reopening. He wondered what kind of heart could say something like that to the very person who had given it life. He wondered if his son even realized what he had done, or if cruelty had become so natural to him that it didn't register anymore. He looked down at his hands, wrinkled and shaking slightly in the lamplight. These were the same hands that had once carried his son on his shoulders, the same hands that had built the walls of this house, the same hands that had cooked, cleaned, and cared. They had done everything love demanded, but now they were treated like they had no worth. Still, the father felt no hatred toward them, only pity, because pity was what remained when love was betrayed. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Each second felt longer than the last. The old man leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He wasn't tired. He was thinking, planning. There was no anger in his thoughts, no desire for shouting or violence. Revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about restoration. It was about balance. If his son believed his father was beneath him, then he would learn what it meant to fall from the height of arrogance. But the father would not rush. Lessons, he knew, were not taught in anger. They were taught in silence. Hours passed. The light from the moon shifted, climbing higher across the window pane. The father eventually rose, his legs stiff from sitting too long. He walked to the kitchen, his steps soft, deliberate. The sight of the broken plate still on the floor made his throat tighten. He didn't clean it. He left it there as a reminder, not for his son, but for himself. A reminder of what love looks like when it's taken for granted. He poured himself a small glass of water, drank slowly, and looked around the kitchen. Every corner of that room had a story. The chipped counter he had fixed himself, the old stove he had bought secondhand when his wife's health was failing, the window where his son used to wave at him after school. This kitchen had been his world once. Now, it felt foreign, hostile. He realized, with quiet pain, that he no longer belonged here. Not because it wasn't his house, but because respect no longer lived within its walls. As the night deepened, memories came rushing in, uninvited but vivid. He saw his younger self, coming home after 12 hours of labor, smelling of sweat and soil. He saw his wife waiting at the door, smiling despite her tired eyes. He saw his son running toward him, small arms wrapping around his legs, saying how much he had missed him. Those moments had been his treasure. They were what kept him alive through every hardship. But now, those same memories hurt more than any wound, because the child he had once loved more than his own life had become a stranger wearing his son's face. He went back to his chair, sat down, and took out an old photo album from the drawer. The pages were yellowed, the corners frayed. He turned them slowly, one by one, tracing the faces with trembling fingers. His son at 5 years old, holding his first toy truck. His son at 10, wearing a school medal. His son at 18, shaking hands at graduation. Every photo was a piece of the life he had built, the proof of years of love that now meant nothing. The father smiled faintly, not out of joy, but out of irony. He realized that while his son had grown taller, stronger, and richer, he had grown smaller in soul. Success had stolen his heart and replaced it with pride. And now that pride had blinded him completely. The wind outside rustled the trees, whispering through the open window. It carried with it the faint sound of distant dogs barking. The father looked out again at the sky, the same moon shining on every home, even the ones filled with love. He wondered what it must feel like in those houses, to be respected, to be cared for, to be heard. Then he looked back at his empty plate and whispered to himself in thought, "I will not die here with shame." He decided then that tomorrow would be different. He wouldn't speak of it. He wouldn't confront his son with words that could be dismissed as emotional. Instead, he would act, quietly, intelligently, effectively. The son had forgotten that this house, this roof, and even the ground beneath his feet existed because of his father's sweat. He would be reminded, but not through shouting, through silence that hurts more than any noise ever could. Before going to bed, the father walked to his small desk and opened an old folder. Inside were papers, property deeds, bank documents, savings records. He flipped through them slowly, confirming what he already knew. Everything was still in his name. Every signature, every right, every piece of ownership was still his. The son had power only because the father had allowed it. That permission would end now. He took out a pen and paper and began writing notes, small reminders, plans, and contacts. He listed down the lawyer's number, the bank manager's name, and the safe combination. Each note felt like reclaiming a piece of his lost dignity. By the time he was done, the clock read past midnight. The plan was forming clearly in his mind now, sharp and calm. When he finally lay down on his bed, he didn't close his eyes immediately. He looked around the room, the same one he had built years ago when his wife was alive. Her old photograph still sat by the lamp. He touched it gently, whispering a promise. "Tomorrow, I will make things right." Sleep didn't come easily, but peace did. For the first time in years, the father felt control returning to his hands. His heart no longer trembled with fear. He had no more illusions left about his son. The love he had once poured endlessly had dried up, replaced by something stronger: resolve. By dawn, his decision was complete. The morning light would bring a different day, one where the man who had been treated like a beggar would stand tall again, one where respect would no longer be begged for, but taken back through quiet, undeniable truth. And as he finally drifted to sleep, one thought settled deep in his mind. The same floor that had seen his humiliation would soon witness justice. When morning light slipped through the old curtains, the father was already awake. He hadn't slept much, but his mind was clear, clearer than it had been in years. The humiliation from the night before still burned quietly in his chest, but it no longer hurt like shame. It felt like fuel. For the first time in a long while, he felt the fire of purpose. Age had slowed his body, but not his will. The words his son had thrown at him, "Dogs eat here, not you," still echoed, but now they had turned into something else, a promise of reckoning. He sat by the window, watching the sunrise. The golden light touched the walls that he had painted himself decades ago, and it reminded him of how much of himself he had poured into this house. Every nail, every corner, every brick had been his labor, his love. He had built this place not for luxury, but for family. It was meant to be a home, not a stage for cruelty. But now, it had become a cage, ruled by a man who had forgotten his roots. The father took a slow breath and whispered a silent vow to himself. Today, everything would change. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need revenge that spilled blood or broke bones. He only needed one thing: justice, real justice. The kind that doesn't scream, doesn't threaten, but simply reveals truth in its quietest form. He knew what had to be done, and he would do it without hesitation. The house was still quiet when he began. His son was asleep, probably dreaming without guilt, unaware that his comfortable world was about to crumble. The father walked to the living room, his steps steady, his hands firm despite the morning chill. He opened the drawer near the cabinet and took out a small iron keychain. It held the keys to everything: cupboards, pantry, storeroom, even the gate lock. These were keys his son had long forgotten the importance of. He started with the kitchen. Every cupboard, every drawer, every shelf, locked. The refrigerator door clicked shut with a sound that carried finality. The jars of rice, pulses, and spices, the tins of oil, even the bread box, all sealed. It wasn't cruelty, it was reflection. Every lock symbolized a boundary, a reminder that what is taken for granted must be earned again. Then, he went to the small study where his safe was kept. Inside were the property papers, savings account documents, and the original ownership deeds of the house. He sat at the table and looked through them slowly, each page a piece of his life's work. His name was on every line, every signature, proof that everything his son enjoyed came from him. The realization didn't make him proud, it made him sad. He had worked a lifetime for a man who now thought he owed him nothing. He took out the phone and called his lawyer, an old friend who had stood by him through the years. The voice on the other end was calm and respectful. The father explained what had happened, not with tears or drama, but with the simplicity of a man who had already accepted truth. Within minutes, his lawyer agreed to meet him the next day to begin the paperwork. The plan was clear. He would transfer the property temporarily under a trusted name, freezing his son's access to it. Every financial tie, every convenience that made his son feel powerful would vanish silently. When he hung up, a strange calm washed over him. It wasn't happiness, just peace. The kind that comes from finally choosing self-respect over silence. He walked around the house again, each step lighter than the last. His son's words no longer felt like wounds. They were warnings. warnings of what happens when kindness becomes submission. By afternoon, he sat outside on the porch with his cup of tea. The sun was warm, and the birds sang softly in the trees. Life around him carried on as usual, but inside that house, the balance of power had shifted. He felt it, quiet, invisible, irreversible. The locks, the documents, the decisions, they were all small acts of liberation. As he sipped his tea, he thought of the younger version of himself, the man who used to believe that love could fix everything, that children always repay sacrifice with gratitude. He realized now that love without limits creates monsters, that too much giving can blind a person to the danger of being taken for granted. He didn't regret loving his son, but he regretted never teaching him boundaries. Today would correct that. The father spent the rest of the afternoon writing. He made a list of everything his son controlled, utilities, bills, accounts, and began calling to have them changed. The phone calls were short and polite, but firm. By the time the sun began to set, every account was updated, every authorization removed. His son's name no longer existed on anything that mattered. The man who thought he ruled the house was now standing on borrowed ground. When evening came, the father cooked a simple meal, enough for one. He didn't touch his son's plate or call him to eat. He sat alone at the same table where he had been humiliated, ate in silence, and then washed his own dishes. The sound of running water felt cleansing. Every motion was deliberate, calm, patient, final. He didn't look toward his son's room. He didn't need to. Tomorrow would speak louder than any confrontation. As night fell, the old man lit a single lamp and went to his desk once more. He wrote a letter, not of anger, but of truth. It wasn't addressed to his son, it was addressed to himself, a record of everything that had happened, every word that had been said, every insult that had been endured. It wasn't to be sent or read by anyone. It was simply his way of closing a chapter that had hurt too long. When he finished, he folded it neatly, placed it in an envelope, and locked it in the drawer. The night was colder than usual, but he didn't feel it. He sat outside for a while, watching the stars appear one by one. He thought of his wife, long gone, but never forgotten. She had always told him that patience was a man's greatest strength. He had believed her, and she had been right. But patience had to end where self-respect began. Tonight, he had finally drawn that line. As he looked at the dark sky, he wondered what his son would do in the morning. How he would react when he found every door locked, every key gone, every privilege stripped away. Would he be angry? Probably. Would he understand? Maybe not immediately. But someday, when the hunger of ego meets the hunger of the stomach, lessons take root. He pictured his son walking into the kitchen, expecting everything to be the same comfort, the same food waiting, the same father ready to forgive. But not this time. This time, the man who had been treated like a beggar would hold the power of ownership in silence. The son would come face to face with the emptiness he had created, not in the cupboards, but in his own heart. Before going to bed, the father checked every lock once more. The keys rested in his pocket, clinking softly as he walked. They weren't just metal pieces anymore. They were symbols of control reclaimed, of dignity restored. He went to his room, turned off the lamp, and lay down. For the first time in many years, sleep came easily. He didn't dream of his son that night. He dreamed of his younger days, the early mornings when he worked with purpose, the nights when his wife laughed while serving dinner, the warmth of family that used to live here. Those memories didn't hurt anymore. They gave him peace, because now he knew. The love he gave hadn't been wasted. It had built something strong within him, something his son could never take away again. When dawn came, he woke before anyone else. The house was still, but he could feel the change in the air. Today, his plan would complete itself. He looked in the mirror, straightened his shirt, and smiled faintly. The man looking back at him wasn't weak anymore. He was calm, firm, and untouchable. He went to the kitchen, unlocked only one cupboard, the one with the tea leaves and sugar. He made his morning tea, just as he always had. But this time, it tasted different. It tasted like quiet freedom. The morning sun climbed higher, filling the house with light. Soon, his son would wake up and learn the meaning of hunger. Not the hunger of the body, but of humility. The father took another sip of tea and whispered to himself, "Today, he learns." And when the sound of his son's footsteps finally echoed down the hallway, the father didn't flinch, didn't move. He was ready, not for confrontation, but for closure. What would happen next would not just be revenge, it would be revelation. The morning unfolded slowly, almost too quietly. The house that once rang with noise and laughter now carried an uneasy stillness, the kind that comes before a storm that no one expects. The father moved through his home with a steady purpose. His steps were light, his mind calm, his plan already set in motion. There was no trembling in his hands, no second thoughts. Every choice he had made the night before was now taking shape, each action a quiet answer to years of disrespect. He walked into the kitchen again, where the faint sunlight filtered through dusty curtains. The floor was clean. He had swept it himself early that morning. The same floor where his food had been thrown, where his heart had been broken, now gleamed with a cold kind of purity. He wanted it spotless, not because he cared about cleanliness, but because the next lesson his son would learn deserved a stage free from chaos. He checked the locks once more. The cupboards, the refrigerator, the storage room, all sealed. Even the little snack cabinet by the hallway, which his son often raided late at night, was now bolted shut. Each metallic click of the lock sounded like a heartbeat of justice. For the first time in years, the father felt a sense of control returning to his life. After securing the kitchen, he went to his small study. The papers were already stacked neatly on the desk. Property documents, bank statements, old receipts. He had organized everything the night before. The phone sat beside them, the screen glowing faintly with the lawyer's contact saved under the simple name, Mr. Rao. They had spoken again that morning, confirming that the paperwork for transferring property rights temporarily had already been prepared. All that was left was his signature. He looked at the documents and smiled faintly. His son had spent years acting like the master of this house, walking with pride, giving orders as if he had earned everything. But in truth, he owned nothing. The land, the walls, the name, all still belonged to the man he now called a burden. The father thought about that as he signed his name on the last page with a slow, deliberate stroke. Ink met paper like a final seal of destiny. Then came the financial part. He had already spoken to the bank manager, an old acquaintance who had known the family for decades. Together, they had quietly removed his son's authorization from all joint accounts. The son no longer had access to any of the money that once made him feel powerful. No more credit cards, no more transfers, no more illusions of control. The father made sure every detail was airtight. By noon, the entire house had transformed, not physically, but in spirit. What was once the son's kingdom was now a fortress under the father's silent rule. No one outside would notice the change. From the outside, it still looked like an ordinary day. Birds still sang on the fence, neighbors still passed by unaware. But inside those walls, a lesson was about to unfold that would shake the foundation of arrogance. He sat at the dining table, sipping his tea slowly. He wasn't thinking of revenge anymore. He was thinking of reflection, how years of silence had led to this moment. Every insult, every ignored word, every cold stare had been stored inside him like fire waiting for air. Last night's cruelty had simply opened the door. He had decided not to leave the house just yet. Leaving would have been too easy for his son, too quick. No, the boy would learn what it feels like to live without privilege, to feel hunger, not because of poverty, but because of his own pride. The father wanted him to experience what it truly meant to be powerless. When the clock struck 1, the son finally emerged from his room. His footsteps were lazy, his hair uncombed, his confidence still intact. He walked to the kitchen, yawning, expecting breakfast waiting for him like every other day. But as soon as he opened the cupboard door, the first lock stopped him, his brow furrowed. He tried another, locked. Then the fridge, locked. Confusion spread across his face like fog. He turned around, looking for his father. The father was sitting in the corner, calm, watching. He didn't speak. He simply sipped his tea, eyes steady, unmoving. The son asked where the keys were, his voice sharp with irritation, but the old man didn't respond. He just gestured lightly toward the table. The son looked there but found nothing. Minutes passed. The son's tone grew louder. He began rattling the cupboard doors, kicking one of the drawers in frustration. But no matter how hard he tried, nothing opened. Every lock held firm. The silence in the room began to thicken, pressing against him like invisible weight. For the first time in his life, the son looked small, like a boy lost in a house he no longer understood. His pride began to crack, replaced by disbelief. He turned to his father, eyes filled with frustration, but the old man remained calm. No anger, no explanation, just the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to defend himself. The son's voice trembled slightly now. He demanded food, shouted about rights, about how this was his house too. But his words bounced off walls that no longer recognized him. The father simply stood up, placed his empty teacup on the table, and walked toward the locked cupboards. Slowly, without saying a word, he pointed down to the floor, the same floor where last night's food had been thrown. The son froze. There, on the spotless tiles, lay a single metal bowl, the kind usually used for pets. Inside it, a small serving of rice, the leftovers from the father's breakfast. The symbolism hit like thunder. The son's face went pale, his chest heaving. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The father looked at him for a long, quiet moment. His expression wasn't cruel. It was tired, disappointed, resolute. Then, in a tone barely above a whisper, he said the words that sealed fate. "Dogs eat here, not you." The echo was unbearable. The son stepped back, his face flushing with shame. The same sentence he had spat in arrogance now returned to him like a mirror, sharper, colder, and undeniable. For the first time, he understood what those words had meant. He looked around the room, as if searching for someone to save him, but there was no one. His wife was visiting her parents. The neighbors wouldn't interfere. He was alone, and the man he had mocked was now the one in control. The father didn't wait for a response. He turned around, walked back to his chair, and sat down, calm as a mountain. The son stood there for several minutes, staring at the floor, his pride collapsing piece by piece. Hunger and humiliation clashed inside him, but the lesson had only just begun. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. The son tried calling food delivery, but found his phone locked. His father had disconnected the Wi-Fi. He tried going out, but the front gate was locked too. The old man had the keys in his pocket, his authority absolute once more. By evening, the son's arrogance had turned to quiet desperation. He paced the living room, his stomach growling, his mind spinning. Every sound of his father moving calmly in the next room made the guilt heavier. He realized that the man he had treated like dirt still held every thread of his comfort. When night came, the father cooked himself another small meal, enough for one. The smell of rice and lentils filled the air again, familiar but now painful for the son. The old man ate slowly, deliberately, letting each bite carry the weight of yesterday's insult. When he was done, he washed his plate, dried it, and placed it neatly on the shelf. Then he walked to his room and closed the door. The son sat alone in the dark kitchen, staring at the same floor where he had thrown his father's food just a night ago. Now it was empty, cold. He could almost see the image of his own cruelty staring back at him from the tiles. And for the first time, he understood. Respect can't be demanded, love can't be forced, and arrogance always eats itself in the end. That night, hunger taught him what humility never could. He slept on an empty stomach, his mind haunted by his father's quiet power. The next morning, when the father unlocked the kitchen again, he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The message had already been carved into his son's heart, forever. And from that day on, the boy who once ruled the house learned to lower his voice, soften his tone, and think twice before speaking. The father never mentioned the incident again. He didn't have to. His silence had done what words never could. it had restored balance. The next morning broke quietly, but the air in the house felt different, heavier, slower, charged with something invisible. Sunlight streamed through the window, glancing off the polished floor that had become the scene of so much unspoken truth. The father rose early as always, his body aching from years of labor, but his mind clear and sharp. He brewed his tea and sat by the window, looking out at the garden that he had planted decades ago with his wife. The flowers were still blooming, calm, pure, untouched by the chaos that humans brought into their own lives. Inside, the son still slept, unaware that the previous night had marked the beginning of his lesson. Hunger had a strange way of humbling even the proudest heart, and soon it would do its work on him. The father didn't need to rush anything. Lessons learned through pain linger longer than those taught through comfort. He finished his tea slowly, every sip steady and deliberate. His hands didn't tremble. There was no anger in him, only quiet control. He had reached that rare place in life where emotion no longer dictated action. He no longer wanted revenge. He wanted revelation, a truth so clear that even arrogance couldn't deny it. By the time his son woke up, the old man had already completed his morning routine. He was sitting on the porch when the door creaked open. The son appeared, his face pale, his eyes swollen with the kind of tiredness that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from too much thinking. He looked uneasy, uncertain, almost childlike for the first time in years. The father observed silently as the boy hesitated near the kitchen, glancing toward the cupboards as if hoping yesterday's locks had magically opened overnight. But they hadn't. He pulled at one handle. Still locked. Another. Still locked. The refrigerator handle didn't move either. The sound of rattling metal filled the room. His frustration returned, but this time it wasn't the loud anger of arrogance. It was the small, pitiful sound of realization. The house no longer answered to him. The father finally stood up, his cane tapping softly against the floor as he walked into the kitchen. The son turned around instantly, trying to sound casual. He said he needed to just grab a bite, but his eyes betrayed him. They were pleading now. He was hungry, not just for food, but for the comfort of control. But his father wasn't there to feed either. He was there to finish what had begun. The old man moved to the counter, placed his cane aside, and calmly took out a single key from his pocket. The son's eyes lit up for a second, hope flashing like a dying flame. The father walked to one of the cupboards, unlocked it slowly, and took out a small plate of rice, plain, cold, simple. Then he locked it again and turned around. He placed the plate on the same table where the previous night's humiliation had begun. The son stood frozen, unsure what to do. The father gestured toward the chair, not saying a word. The son sat down, the weight of guilt pressing hard on his shoulders. He reached out for the plate, but the old man's voice, calm, low, controlled, stopped him. He didn't speak in anger. He spoke like a man reciting truth itself. He said nothing about revenge, nothing about pain, nothing about cruelty. Instead, he spoke only once, quietly. Now you know what it means to earn a meal. The son's head dropped. His fingers tightened on the edge of the table. His pride, once sharp and loud, had melted into silence. He couldn't look his father in the eyes. The father turned around, took his cane, and walked toward the window. His movements were slow, but his presence filled the room. He stood there for a moment, looking outside at the sunlight dancing over the garden. His heart was heavy, but steady. He didn't enjoy his son's discomfort. He simply accepted it as the price of truth. He thought of all the years he had cooked, cleaned, and sacrificed without expecting gratitude. He remembered the small hands that once clung to his leg, the voice that once called him hero. Those memories no longer hurt. They simply reminded him that love, when taken for granted, becomes invisible. The son had needed to see what invisible love looked like when it finally disappeared. By noon, the house had become a strange mix of silence and reflection. The son stayed mostly in his room, emerging occasionally to check if the locks had changed. Each time, the same disappointment awaited him. Every door that refused to open was a reminder of what he had lost. Respect, once gone, doesn't return easily. The father spent his afternoon writing again. Not letters this time, but instructions. Clear, detailed, unemotional instructions for his lawyer and banker. He wanted to make sure everything he owned was accounted for, every asset protected. This house, this property, this legacy, it would never again be in the hands of someone who treated family as disposable. Evening arrived with the same quiet rhythm. The son's hunger had now turned to weakness. His arrogance had drained away, replaced by shame. He walked into the living room where his father sat reading. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, but the words never came. The old man didn't even look up. He simply raised his hand, not in anger, but in calm dismissal. The message was clear. Apologies meant nothing when respect came too late. The son sank into a chair across the room, his body slouched, his face pale. He stared at the floor for a long time. The same floor that had seen his cruelty now watched him crumble. The father could feel the heaviness of the moment, but he didn't interfere. He let silence finish the work that words could never do. Hours passed. The sun disappeared, replaced by the soft glow of the evening lamp. The old man finally spoke, not to scold, not to comfort, but to declare. He said, "This house belongs to me. Everything you have enjoyed here, every meal, every comfort, every wall, came from me. You took them for granted. Now they are gone from your hands." The son didn't reply. He couldn't. The words were too sharp, too true. Then, the father added one final line. "Tomorrow, this house will no longer have your name on it." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The son looked up, confused, but the father had already stood up and walked toward his room, the sound of his cane echoing through the hall like a quiet gavel of judgment. That night, the father slept deeply, peacefully. The lesson was done, not because his son had suffered, but because truth had finally spoken. The balance had been restored. The next morning, the lawyer arrived with a brown envelope. The documents were ready. The house, the land, and the funds were all legally secured under new ownership, no longer vulnerable to greed. The father signed every page carefully, each signature an act of closure. His lawyer looked at him with quiet respect, fully understanding what these papers meant. By noon, the old man had packed a single suitcase. Clothes, documents, his late wife's photograph. Nothing else. He didn't need anything more. He walked through the house one last time, touching the walls gently, saying goodbye without words. When he reached the kitchen, he paused. The floor still shone clean, reflecting the morning light. He smiled faintly. The same ground that had once been stained with humiliation was now sacred again, not because it was spotless, but because it had seen truth unfold. He turned around one last time. His son stood at the doorway, eyes red, face hollow. There were no insults now, no arrogance left, just silence and regret. The father didn't look angry. He simply nodded, not forgiveness, not farewell, just acknowledgement, a recognition that their bond had broken and that some things, once shattered, can never be rebuilt. Then he walked past him, out the front door, and never looked back. The neighbors saw the old man leave with his suitcase and his calm dignity. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. People could see when a man left, not in defeat, but in quiet victory. By evening, the son sat alone at the dinner table, surrounded by locked cupboards and empty silence. Hunger gnawed at him again, but this time it wasn't just for food. It was for forgiveness, for the kind of warmth he had thrown away without thinking. He looked at the floor, at the same place where he had once thrown his father's plate, and tears filled his eyes. That night, he ate from that same floor, not because his father told him to, but because life had brought him full circle. And as he ate, he realized that every act of cruelty eventually finds its way home. The next morning, the father woke up in a small rented room in the countryside. The air was fresh, the sound of birds filled the space, and peace, real, deep peace, finally returned to his heart. He looked out the window and smiled softly. He had lost a son, but he had regained himself. The lesson was complete. The days that followed moved like slow echoes through the quiet house. The son remained there, surrounded by walls that no longer felt like his own. The locks on the cupboards had been removed after the father left, but food no longer tasted the same. Every bite carried the bitterness of guilt. Every sound in the house reminded him of the silence he had forced upon the man who built it. The laughter that once filled the evenings was gone. What remained was emptiness, heavy, echoing, unrelenting. The neighbors began to notice the change. For years, they had seen the father tending to his garden every morning, waving politely, always gentle in his manners. But now, the gate stayed closed. The old man's chair on the porch was empty. When they asked the son where his father was, he mumbled excuses about a short trip, but his words carried no conviction. They could sense something deeper, something wrong. Gossip grew like vines, silent at first, then spreading quickly. People began whispering about what might have happened inside those walls. The son avoided their eyes. He no longer walked with pride. The arrogance that once made him the loudest in every room had faded into quiet shame. His friends stopped visiting. His wife, too, spoke less to him. Even his children sensed something had shifted. They avoided sitting near him at dinner, their eyes filled with confusion and distance. The family he had tried to dominate now lived like strangers under one roof. Meanwhile, far away in a small countryside cottage, the father lived differently. His days were simple. He woke with the sunrise, brewed his own tea, and sat by the window watching the world move at its natural pace. There were no raised voices, no harsh words, no humiliation, only peace. He spent time walking in the garden behind the cottage, where the flowers grew freely, untouched by arrogance. Every petal, every leaf felt like freedom. The pain of betrayal had turned into quiet wisdom. He didn't talk about what had happened. He didn't need to. Life has a way of spreading truth without anyone speaking it. Soon, the story reached the community, through whispers, through visits, through the lawyer who handled the property transfer. People began to learn that the old man had left his house not in defeat, but in dignity. That he had taught a lesson so silent, yet so unforgettable, that even the proudest heart could not escape it. Within a week, his son's reputation began to crumble. The same neighbors who once admired his confidence now avoided him. Some looked at him with pity, others with contempt. The story of how he had thrown his father's food on the floor spread like wildfire, each retelling more brutal than the last. He made his old father eat from the ground, one said. No, another corrected. His father made him eat from it the next day. Truth and rumor blended, but the core remained. The son's cruelty was exposed, and his father's silence had become a legend. The humiliation became unbearable. He couldn't walk to the market without feeling eyes on him. Even those who didn't know the details could sense his disgrace. There was something in the way he moved now, shoulders hunched, gaze lowered, that spoke of guilt louder than words ever could. The respect he once commanded was gone, replaced by whispers that followed him like shadows. At home, things only grew worse. His wife, who had once defended him out of habit, began to distance herself. She had seen the shame in his eyes when the truth came out. She had heard the neighbors talking. She had watched their children's disappointment when they learned what he had done. Love, she realized, cannot survive without respect, and respect cannot survive cruelty. The children, too, began to ask questions. They wanted to know where their grandfather was. They missed his stories, his gentle laugh, his steady presence at the dinner table. The son tried to change the subject, but the questions kept returning. Each one felt like a wound he couldn't hide. Eventually, the truth began to seep out even within his own home. The son who had called his father weak now sat in the same kitchen, trembling at the sight of his own reflection. Weeks passed. The son tried to visit the countryside to find his father, but when he arrived, the cottage was locked. The caretaker there told him the old man didn't want visitors. That was all. No anger, no revenge, just refusal. It was worse than confrontation. Silence has a way of cutting deeper than any words. The father, from his quiet distance, knew about his son's visits. The caretaker informed him each time. but he never agreed to meet. He didn't want an apology made out of guilt or loneliness. He wanted his son to understand that forgiveness is not given. It is earned through change. Until that change happened, the door would remain closed. Months turned into a year. The father's peace grew deeper, while the son's guilt grew heavier. The house that had once been full of noise now felt haunted. Every corner reminded him of what he had done: the table, the kitchen, even the floor. He often found himself sitting there late at night, staring at the same spot where he had once thrown the plate, whispering to himself, trying to understand why he had done it. But the answer never came. Some mistakes don't have explanations, only consequences. One afternoon, he received a letter from the lawyer. His hands trembled as he opened it. The paper was brief, cold, and final. It stated that the ownership of the family house had been permanently transferred. His father had donated the property to an elderly welfare trust, ensuring it would be turned into a home for abandoned seniors. The irony crushed him. The same house where he had humiliated his father would now become a place of comfort for those who had been abandoned by their children. The letter also mentioned something else. The father had left a note with the trust, a message not to be delivered directly, but to be made public during the home's opening ceremony. The son's heart sank. He knew what was coming. When the day arrived, people gathered for the ceremony. The house had been cleaned, repaired, and painted anew. Fresh flowers adorned the porch. The father stood at the center of it all, older now, but still dignified, surrounded by community members, reporters, and volunteers. Cameras flashed, but he remained composed. He didn't crave attention, only truth. As the ceremony began, one of the trustees read out the note written by the old man himself. The words were simple, calm, and devastating. "This home is built for those who gave everything and were left with nothing. I once lived here too, until respect left the walls. To every parent who feels invisible, know this: silence is not weakness. It is strength waiting for the right moment to speak." The crowd fell silent. Tears welled in many eyes, and among them, at the back of the gathering, stood the son. Hidden behind the crowd, unable to step forward, unable to look up. Each word from that letter felt like a stone laid on his chest. He had come hoping for forgiveness, but what he found instead was legacy, a story that would outlive both of them. From that day on, the town remembered the old man not as a victim, but as a symbol of quiet strength. His story spread across communities, told in markets, in temples, in late-night conversations between families. "Don't forget what happened in that house," people would say. "Don't forget how pride fell and respect rose again." The son, meanwhile, lived in the shadow of that story. No one needed to remind him of what he had done. Life did it every day. Every time he saw an elderly person walking alone, every time he passed by the old house, now filled with laughter and care, he felt the echo of his father's silence calling him to account. Years later, he finally gathered the courage to visit the home again. The volunteers recognized him instantly, not with hostility, but with quiet pity. They led him to a small garden at the back, where his father sat, reading. Time had aged him, but his eyes were still clear, steady, unbroken. The son knelt before him, tears streaming down his face. Words failed him. But the father didn't speak either. He simply reached out, placed a hand on his shoulder, and nodded once. Not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Then he turned back to his book. That moment was enough. The son understood. Forgiveness had already been given long ago, not through words, but through the silence that had saved them both. The world outside continued to change, but the lesson remained eternal. Disrespect dies in public shame. Dignity lives forever in quiet truth. And so, the old man's story became a whisper passed through generations, the tale of a father who was told that dogs eat from the floor, but who taught his son to taste his own cruelty. The old man's new life began quietly, not with fanfare, not with anger, not with the weight of what had happened, but with stillness. Stillness that came after years of noise, years of disrespect, years of love given freely, and repaid with cruelty. The countryside cottage where he had chosen to live was small, surrounded by trees that whispered instead of shouted, by wind that carried no bitterness. For the first time in decades, peace didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like freedom. He woke up with the sunrise each day, his routine as simple as the earth around him. Tea first, made with his own hands. Then a slow walk outside, his cane tapping gently against the stone path. He watched the sky change colors, from gray to gold, from night to day, a reminder that everything in life moves on, whether we want it to or not. He had learned that truth painfully, but now he accepted it gracefully. The mornings were quiet, except for birdsong and the distant laughter of children playing in the nearby fields. He often stood by his gate and watched them, their faces full of the same innocence his son once had. It stirred something deep in him, a strange mix of sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for what was lost, gratitude for what still existed. Life itself. He kept busy, not to escape the past, but to live fully in the present. He tended to a small garden behind the cottage, tomatoes, herbs, flowers, and one old mango tree that reminded him of his youth. He spoke little, but his silence wasn't emptiness. It was contentment. Every leaf that grew felt like a sign that even after betrayal, new life can still bloom. Sometimes villagers came to visit him. They had heard the story, the one that had spread far beyond the town, carried on whispers and retellings. To them, he wasn't just an old man anymore. He was a symbol of strength, of quiet justice, of the kind of dignity that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Some came for advice, some came to thank him, and some just came to listen. The old man never refused them. He spoke gently, never with pride, only with reflection. "Anger," he once said to a young visitor, "burns fast and leaves ash. Silence burns slow, but it leaves wisdom." He became a sort of teacher without ever trying to be one. His words, though few, carried the weight of truth. Parents told their children about him, couples spoke of his patience, and elders saw in him the voice they had long lost in their own families. In his stillness, he had become a mirror, showing others what they had forgotten, that respect is not demanded. It is earned through humility and love. Occasionally, he received letters, some from strangers, others from old acquaintances, but one envelope stood out each time it arrived. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. It was from his son. The first few letters were filled with apologies, words that tried to explain the inexcusable. "I was angry," the son wrote. "I didn't understand what I was doing. Please come home." But the old man didn't reply. Forgiveness is not a door one opens with a single knock. Months passed, and the letters kept coming. They changed in tone, from pleading to reflective, from defensive to regretful. Each letter was shorter, softer, more human, and though he still didn't reply, he read every one. He placed them all in a wooden box beside his bed, not because he wanted to hold on to pain, but because they were proof that change had begun. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, the old man sat outside with his tea, feeling the cool breeze brush against his face. A boy from the village ran up to him, holding a newspaper. "They wrote about you again," the boy said, smiling. The old man smiled back and took the paper. The headline read, "Elderly man who was thrown out turns his pain into purpose." There was a picture of him, standing before the home he had donated to the elderly, the same house that once echoed with cruelty, now alive with laughter and kindness. He read the article slowly. It spoke about how the home had grown, how other families had started donating, how the community now respected the elderly more. As he read, he felt something warm spread through his chest. It wasn't pride, it was peace. The story of his pain had become someone else's protection. The world had taken what broke him and turned it into something that healed others. That, he thought, was justice in its purest form. The villagers celebrated the anniversary of the home's opening each year. They invited him every time, and though he rarely attended, he always sent a donation, quietly, anonymously. He didn't want gratitude, he wanted continuity. He wanted to make sure that no parent ever felt what he had felt, the sting of disrespect from the very heart that once beat under their care. As the seasons changed, so did his heart. The anger, which had once been sharp and alive, faded into memory. Forgiveness didn't come as a sudden realization. It came like the slow passing of winter. One morning, he woke up, looked out at the sky, and realized he no longer carried the weight of his son's cruelty. What remained was compassion, not for the past, but for the fragile humanity that causes such harm. He had learned that even those who wound others often suffer within themselves. His son had not been born cruel. He had become lost in pride and greed. The old man finally saw that understanding does not excuse, but it heals. That afternoon, he wrote a letter, the first he had written in years. It was short and simple. I have no anger left. I have no hate left. But I have no home left either. Some wounds do not close. They simply stop bleeding. Take care of yourself. He sent it without expecting a reply, and he never got one. But he didn't need to. The act of writing it was enough. It was his way of setting both of them free. Years later, when his health began to fade, the villagers took care of him. They brought him food, sat with him in the evenings, listened to his stories. Some called him Grandpa, others Baba. He smiled at each name. Family, he realized, is not just blood. It is the hearts that choose to love you without reason. One rainy evening, as he lay in bed, weak but calm, he asked the caretaker to bring him the wooden box by his bedside. Inside were the letters, every one his son had written. He looked through them, smiling faintly. They were old, creased, and yellowed with time. He placed them on his chest, closed his eyes, and whispered softly to the wind outside. It's over now. When he passed away, the news spread quietly through the town. The home he had built held a memorial service in his honor. People from across the region came, villagers, workers, families, even children who had grown up hearing his story. They spoke not of revenge or bitterness, but of dignity, courage, and forgiveness. At the end of the ceremony, the caretaker read one final note found among his belongings. If you ever find yourself disrespected, don't shout. Don't beg. Silence is not surrender. It is the beginning of your power. Wait for time. Truth always finds its way home. The words echoed through the hall, through the hearts of everyone present. And among the crowd, quietly at the back, stood his son, older now, grayer, humbled by life. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He simply bowed his head and whispered a thank you that no one heard but the air itself. That night, as the lights in the home dimmed, the residents sat together in silence. Some prayed, others wept, and some smiled through their tears. The old man had left the world the same way he had lived his last years, with calm, with truth, with unshakable grace. And somewhere, perhaps beyond time and regret, he finally found peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come from winning against someone, but from rising above everything they did to you. He had turned humiliation into honor, betrayal into lesson, and silence into legacy. And in that stillness, the world remembered him not for the cruelty he endured, but for the dignity he never let go of. Years passed, and with time, the story of the old man became less of an event and more of a lesson, one that lived quietly in the hearts of those who heard it. His name wasn't carved on any statue, yet his silence spoke louder than history books. He didn't change the world with speeches or power. He changed it with one quiet truth, that dignity is the only wealth time cannot steal. In his final years, the grandfather often sat on his veranda, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the horizon fade into gold each evening. The sun always seemed gentler to him now. The warmth that touched his skin wasn't just sunlight. It was peace. His eyes, aged but steady, no longer carried the weight of betrayal, only the calm of understanding. Life, he realized, had been both cruel and kind in equal measure. Cruel enough to test his heart, kind enough to let him rebuild it. He often thought about his journey, not as a story of revenge, but as one of rediscovery. When his son had thrown his food on the floor, he had thought that was the end of his dignity. But that moment, as painful as it was, became the seed of everything that followed. It taught him that silence could be a sword sharper than words, that patience could expose truth better than anger ever could. He learned that sometimes the best way to teach someone respect is not to punish them, but to let their own actions become their teacher. As he aged, he found joy in the smallest things: the smell of soil after rain, the laughter of the children who visited from the village, the feel of a book's rough pages under his fingertips. He didn't need grand company anymore. His world was enough, quiet, clean, unbroken. The pain that had once haunted him now existed only as a memory, like an old scar that no longer hurt, but still reminded him of survival. Every evening, villagers and travelers came to sit near him, listening as he spoke. He never lectured. He only shared reflections, pieces of his life, polished by time. He spoke about forgiveness, but not the kind that comes easily. Forgiveness, he would say, is not saying what they did was right. It's saying they can't control you anymore. Those who heard him left lighter, understanding that revenge is never about destruction. It's about revelation. Sometimes people asked him if he ever missed his son. The question always lingered for a moment before he answered. He would smile faintly and say, "I miss the boy I raised. But that boy is gone. The man who replaced him taught me who I really am." His answer was never bitter, never cold. It was simply honest. He had stopped trying to rewrite what life had already written. One night, under a sky full of stars, he sat alone, thinking about everything he had seen and learned. He realized that life isn't about winning or losing. It's about carrying your truth without letting it break you. People will betray, hurt, and disappoint, but what defines you is how you rise after they do. He had risen, not in pride, but in peace. He thought of his wife, long gone, and smiled. She had once told him that the hardest storms build the strongest roots. He finally understood what she meant. Every insult, every wound, every lonely night, they hadn't weakened him. They had carved him into something unshakable. When the festival season arrived in the village, the townspeople insisted he join. They built a small stage, decorated with flowers and lights, to honor him. They called it the Day of Respect. People shared stories about their parents, their regrets, their reconciliations. Many cried as they spoke, realizing how often love is ignored until it's too late. The old man listened quietly, tears glistening in his eyes, not from sadness, but from gratitude. His pain had given birth to something beautiful: awareness. When it was his turn to speak, he rose slowly, leaning on his cane. The crowd went silent. His voice was soft, but carried through the air like a calm wind before rain. "We all think time will fix everything, but time only shows who truly wants to fix things. I waited years for respect. Then I realized I didn't need to wait. I needed to walk away. Respect doesn't beg, it doesn't shout. It simply leaves and takes peace with it." The crowd listened, motionless. His words weren't poetic, they were real. They came from the kind of pain only lived experience can forge. He continued, "There is no shame in aging. There is shame only in forgetting who raised you. If your parents sit in silence, listen. If their hands tremble, hold them. Because one day when they're gone, silence will speak back, and it will be louder than any regret." There were no applause, no cheers, just stillness. The kind that happens when truth sinks too deep to react. The villagers rose to their feet quietly, some wiping tears, others bowing their heads. That night, families went home and spoke gently to their elders, some for the first time in years. Change had begun, not through anger, but through empathy. After the festival, the old man returned to his cottage. The night was clear, the air cool. He sat by the window, watching fireflies flicker in the dark. He smiled, thinking how even the smallest lights can guide lost souls. He didn't know how much longer he had, but it didn't matter. His purpose was fulfilled. He had turned cruelty into conscience. He picked up his diary, an old leather-bound book, and wrote his final reflection. "Life taught me through loss. My son taught me through pain. But peace, peace taught me through silence. Do not fear betrayal. Fear losing yourself trying to fix it. Let go with grace. Walk away with dignity. That is the only revenge worth taking. When he finished writing, he closed the book gently and placed it beside the wooden box of letters. He didn't need to open them again. They had served their purpose, reminders of what once was and proof of how far he had come. As dawn arrived, the caretaker found him sitting peacefully, his eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips. The world lost him that morning, but gained something far greater, a story that would never fade. The villagers held a ceremony, not of mourning, but of gratitude. They planted a tree where he had once sat, a tall, strong oak whose roots would hold the soil for generations. On a small stone plaque beneath it, they engraved his final words. He said dogs eat from the floor. I taught him that pride eats faster than hunger, and silence feeds the soul. Years later, travelers passing through the village would stop beneath that tree. They'd hear the story from locals, always told with the same reverence. Some cried, some smiled, but none left unchanged. His story became a mirror for those who had hurt their parents, and a comfort for those who had been hurt. And somewhere beyond time, in a place untouched by pride or pain, the old man's spirit finally rested. Calm, complete, eternal. He had lived, he had suffered, he had taught. And in doing so, he became more than a father betrayed. He became a voice of truth that no cruelty could ever silence. Because in the end, respect is not demanded, it is remembered. And he would be remembered, not for how he was treated, but for how he rose beyond it.